Welcome to the channel, folks. Today we're going to be working on my roommate's lawnmower. It is a Toro Wheel Horse 825, and the first thing we have to do is make the seat fit for my roommate. It's a fairly small lawnmower, and the seat in the full back position is still too small for, honestly, either one of us. So we took some measurements without the seat installed. So the first thing we've got to do is move the seat back. You can see my roommate there sitting on the seat in the factory position and how much room or how little room he had between himself and the steering wheel. And sit on the machine without the seat in place, marked the area where he would be sitting, and made some new holes to move the seat back a little bit. So what I did is I removed the seat from the plate and I measured where my roommate felt comfortable sitting on the plate. We're going to line that up with the back of the seat there. There's also a few other things that we're going to have to do some work on. This thing has been used and abused and not taken very good care of. We did already replace the battery. As you can see, the fuel cap is missing. I'm not sure why. It's $15. They put $12 worth of PVC and rubber on it. This thing has seen better days. On getting it home, we discovered that the left side tie rod had decided it wanted to fall out and not allow us to steer the machine. So we've got to fix that. So today we're just going to be getting into it and figuring out the major things that need to be repaired. Obviously, the first thing I've got to do is get the front end up in the air so we can disassemble the steering system and come up with a solution. So here we are, removing the steering beam and the tie rods from the steering arm so we can get the front end off and do a little bit of maintenance on the bench. Here we are with the steering beam on the bench, and I looked up the factory tie rods. They're $80 a piece for the replacements and not that easy to find, so I decided I'd come up with my own solution. You can see I've got me a couple of Heim joints there. I've got some threaded rod. I've got some solid bar and some half-inch tube. Wasn't quite sure exactly how the end result was going to work out, so I got a few extra bits and bobs in case I needed to make some design adjustments. I figured now, with the beam off, would be a good time to check the spindles, check the wheels, check the bearings, and get everything cleaned and lubed back up properly the way it should be. Once we've got the spindles separated by themselves, we can dunk them in our parts cleaner here. It's not big, but it does the job. And we can start measuring out the materials for our replacement tie rods. You can see I marked the center of the connecting point because we don't care necessarily about the overall length as much as we care about the length between the pivot points. And because I'm using Heim joints and threaded rod, I figured we'd keep the adjustability aspect and cut the rod to just the right length so that we would have some adjustability in the tie rods just in case we needed it. I figured the threaded rod by itself probably wouldn't be all that strong, and while it's not a big, heavy machine, I figured I would use the tube for the structure and the threaded rod simply for the adjustability. So here I am welding a nut onto one end of the rod. That'll allow us to thread the tube up and down the rod to allow us to center it and give us the room to move the heim joints should we need to adjust it later. Got the basic product together here, got to measure it up against the factory part, make sure everything's in order before we try to stick it on there. Everything seems to look good, so I'll give it a little bit of a tighten down, and there we are, replacement tie rod. I'd say altogether, each one of these cost me $10 to $15, for both somewhere in the realm of $20 to $30, which is far cheaper than the $80 a piece the OEM ones were going to cost, had we been able to find them. Now that the spindles have been soaking for a while, we can take them out, give them a nice scrub, get them all cleaned up and ready for paint. And the solution that I've got in that parts cleaner there is not the stuff that comes in the bucket. I've added a few other things to it, and it takes paint off really well. It also takes off skin, latex gloves, any kind of O-ring, some pretty nasty stuff. Which is why you'll probably notice I don't stick my hand in it. After wiping them off real good and taping up the load-bearing surfaces, we're ready to paint what's going to be bare metal, so we can give it a little bit of corrosion protection there. And I did end up letting each coat flash before I applied the next coat. I just figured you guys didn't want to see an hour and a half of paint drying, so we sped it up a bit. The next morning, after the paint's had some time to cure in my 100+ degree garage, we can put some initial grease on the load-bearing surfaces and reassemble the steering beam and the wheels. The previous owners had never cleaned off the backside of the wheels after greasing the Zerks. There's a bunch of caked up mess behind the wheel face there. Anytime you have a grease Zerk, you always want to make sure it's clean both before and after applying grease. Before, because you don't want to get the dirt that's on the outside into the inside where the grease is going. Literally the whole point of the grease is to protect and lubricate. Dirt does neither of those. And after, because you don't want exactly this happening where you get these giant grease dirt cakes building up around an area that you're supposed to be maintaining. So we clean them up real nice, put a little bit of preliminary lubrication on the load-bearing surfaces there, get it all reassembled, new cotter pins, make sure the washers are in good shape, and we're off to the races. I figured it's probably easier to lube the wheels without the steering beam being installed on the machine, so we did that first. Here we are, we're going to apply some grease to the Heim joints. They don't come pre-lubed, and there's no... I will need to get some kind of a protective boot in the future, but for now, just to make sure the machine runs, we're going to grease it up by hand, and we're going to reinstall the beam on the tractor. I suspected something like this might happen. The Heim joints are a little bit larger than the factory tie rod ends were, and we do end up getting some binding here on the steering arm between the Heim joints. The steering did work, but right in the middle, the Heim joints would interfere with each other and you'd get a popping in the steering wheel. What I figured I'd do is I'd saw the end of the steering arm off and weld a new tab on the end of it with holes a little bit further apart. I had a little bit of flat bar laying around, and I think this whole thing took me about an hour and a half to do, cutting off the old tab, measuring the holes, measuring for the new holes, welding the tab back in place. When I ended up measuring the holes on the old tab and the Heim joints, I determined that I needed an extra 6 millimeters of space to give the Heim joints the room to breathe, not interfere with each other. So that's what we did. We got the replacement tab welded up in place. Reinstall the tie rods on the new tab and check for binding. As you can see, good amount of clearance. So all I did was I marked a couple of holes, drilled them out, put the bolts back in the seat through the template to make sure everything would line up, and then just taped the template to the seat plate with a little alignment tab there. Obviously, we don't want to get metal shavings and debris into the engine, nor do we want to have to remove the engine or the plate to do this. Trying to make life a little bit easier on ourselves, so we put a little piece of cardboard there to protect the top of the engine, keep all the metal shavings out of it, keep everything clean, and we drilled our holes straight through. Now in the future I can make these slots if I need to, if we need to move the seat back and forth, but for now it's just going to be a fixed position. After that we put the seat on, and we've got to make sure that the seating position is where we want it to be, so we got to get the roommate back out here to take another sit in it. So the seat position turned out pretty good. He can reach all the controls fairly easily, which was the goal. Now he's thinking he wants the steering wheel up a little bit higher and a little bit closer so you can sit a little bit more relaxed. As it is, he has to lean forward a little bit to reach the steering wheel. And we'd also like some extensions on the pedals so he doesn't have to press the pedals with the ends of his toes. I noticed the blade was in pretty bad shape, so I figured I'd give it a good little sharpen and check the balance. Just for testing purposes, we'll end up getting a new blade, but for now, just to make sure the thing can actually cut some grass, we'll just sharpen this one and we'll give it a go. There we are checking the balance, and it seems as though it's good enough for government work. Now, while I was underneath, I did notice that transmission output shaft pulley was in quite bad shape. When I say quite bad, I mean we had a good 30 degrees of rotation on the pulley independent from the output shaft. Now, the cause of this was that there was nearly no woodruff key. There was a little sliver of metal that I'd call some rolled up tin foil, honestly. So I went around town, got a couple of different woodruff keys, found a couple that were close enough, and then I ended up having to modify it to fit. It was just a tiny bit too wide. So we got a new pulley. So you can see here how bad that key slot is wallowed out. The ID of where the shaft goes in the pulley was a good 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters larger than the shaft itself. So we got a new pulley. That was actually pretty cheap. It was $20 or $30. We measured the shaft, and the shaft seemed okay, but of course you never really know 100% without the specifications until you get this stuff back together. So we got the pulley back on there, and everything seems okay. As I was checking the deck, I noticed that the blade brake was quite worn out. That's this guy right here. And when I looked it up, when the part was available, you could only buy the whole arm as one piece from Toro, and it was $200. It appears as though the part's no longer available, not something we can warrant spending the money on for a $150 lawnmower. So what I figured I'd do is I'd come up with my own solution. Once I got the arm off, I figured I had to get the friction pad off of there so we could try to figure out what we needed to do to replace that guy. That was pretty easy. A couple of rivets, drill off the heads, pry the friction pad up, press out the rivet bodies, and there you go. So in all of my solutions for problems, I generally try to come up with the best mixture between parts available, cost, and reliability, right? So we can replace something with something a little bit different as long as it's not going to greatly negatively affect reliability or cost. To that end, the solution I've come up with for the blade brake is to simply put an automotive brake on it. Now, the friction material for an automotive brake pad is going to be a little bit harder than the friction material that was originally included with the machine, but for the amount of time that the brake is engaged before stopping the blade, it's going to be some number of years before this is going to cause a problem. So the first thing we had to do was make the pad the right size. These pads were perfect. We could just cut them right in half, drill a couple of holes through it for the rivets, countersink the holes so that the rivets wouldn't be extending out beyond the friction material, and finally rivet the new pad to the brake arm and reinstall it on the deck. Now, I did have to take just the smallest amount of pad material off of the brake pad, probably 2 millimeters, just because of the angle of the arm. Whenever you try to disengage the brake, the last little bit of the edge of the brake pad would still be in contact with the pulley. So we took a little bit of friction material off. It is still substantially more material than the factory part. And here we're reinstalling the arm and the engagement spring. And finally, we put the deck back up underneath with new belts so we can get everything adjusted and make sure everything functions as intended.